Hi there. Tonight we step into a Spain where the candles burn low. The streets reek of sewage and wood smoke, and the very air feels tense as if the stones themselves resent the man who rules over them. You're standing at the edge of a muddy Madrid plaza, boots already soaked, and you can hear the distant church bells announcing yet another royal decree. You don't know it yet, but every toll means something new Ferdinand VII has decided to break, twist, or abolish, usually at your expense. You probably won't survive this version of Spain, at least not without some bruises and a hefty dose of frustration. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I'm always curious. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the capital streets as the year ticks just past 1814. Ferdinand VII, recently returned from years of exile, has decided Spain's brief experiment with a constitutional monarchy was far too modern for his taste. He tears up the 1812 constitution nicknamed La Pepa by the people, a charter that promised freedoms, some rights, and even a hint of democracy, and declares himself absolute monarch again. The people cheer at first, because who doesn't? Like a familiar king after a war? But the cheers sour quickly when you realize Ferdinand hates just about everyone. He despises liberals for drafting that constitution. He despises French-leaning nobles for bowing to Napoleon. And he even despises the very peasants who cheer for him, treating them like gnats buzzing around his silken sleeves. He spends his first months on the throne, dissolving the elected Cortes, jailing journalists, and outlawing gatherings of more than 4 people if those gatherings look political, which, in Ferdinand's book, could be anything from reading a pamphlet to chatting too loudly at the market. Imagine trying to buy onions while whispering like it's some high-stakes spy mission. Soldiers patrol the plazas, eyes sharp for anyone muttering about liberty. You keep your head down, clutch your basket, and try not to look like someone who remembers that brief taste of freedom. One mainstream fact stands tall. Ferdinand became known as El Deseado, the desired, when he returned. But the title soon turned to bitter irony as his policies dragged Spain backward, undoing reforms and plunging the country into a reactionary swamp. By the time you've walked a mile through this city, you've passed at least 3 gallows erected for traitors, some of whom simply owned liberal pamphlets. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand truly feared a democratic uprising, or simply relished the raw thrill of watching enemies dangle in the breeze. Maybe it's both. At the same time, Spain is broke, battered from Napoleon's invasion, and seething with uprisings. The colonies in Latin America, inspired by revolution, are breaking free one by one. Ferdinand's answer? Crank up taxes, demand loyalty oaths, and send ill-supplied armies to far-off continents, most of which never return. You overhear a captain in a tavern mutter that the king's war plans are like throwing wine bottles into the sea and hoping they swim back full. He's not far off. Spain hemorrhages wealth while Ferdinand surrounds himself with sycophants, many of whom feed his growing paranoia that conspirators lurk in every shadow. And here's your first quirky tidbit. Despite his power, Ferdinand is so afraid of assassination that he reportedly has his bedroom guarded not by soldiers, but by a troop of mutes, yes, actual mute attendants, so no one can overhear his nightly rants or reveal how often he wakes screaming about imagined plots. It's a strange, eerie courtly detail that makes you wonder if he trusted silence more than any loyal words. As you shuffle past the royal palace, you notice its windows ablaze with golden light while the streets outside drown in darkness. Children cry from hunger, beggars cough near the fountains, and somewhere in the distance, a carriage splashes through a puddle, carrying one of Ferdinand's loyal ministers home from another late-night session of plotting. The divide feels obscene. But you keep walking. A drunk near the palace gates mutters, "He calls himself King of Spain, but he's only king of this palace. The rest of us? We're just ghosts he hasn't noticed yet." You almost laugh, but you stifle it, because the last person who joked too loudly about Ferdinand ended up relocated to a fortress prison in Ceuta. Still, despite the fear, the anger simmers. You hear whispers in the taverns about secret society's liberals plotting uprisings, soldiers passing coded messages, exiles scheming in London. But for now, Ferdinand's grip is tight, his shadow long, and his paranoia even longer. As you finally reach your cold inn room, shutters rattling in the wind, you can't shake the thought that this king, who once called himself Desired, is quickly becoming the most despised man in his own kingdom. And somehow this is only the beginning of his descent into infamy. You slip back through the heavy mahogany doors of the royal palace, the echo of your boots swallowed by plush burgundy carpets and the low murmur of courtiers. The air here is thick with the mingled scents of orange blossom, melted wax, and something more exotic, jasmine-infused oils meant to awaken the senses. Just beyond a gilded archway, you find yourself in a long corridor lined with silk-draped alcoves, each one housing a tapestry or statue depicting Spain's past glories. But your eyes aren't drawn to heroic kings on horseback or saints with halos. They're locked on the whispered rumors that cling to every marble column dot. By the time Ferdinand VII takes power, he's already known for his passion for pleasure. A fact that made its way into every court gossip column if there had been columns open to facts. Mainstream history notes that the king commissioned an elaborate pleasure apartments wing in the palace, complete with an adjoining menagerie of exotic birds whose songs played like a perverse soundtrack to his nightly quests. You push past a pair of ceremonial guards' face-painted huskies dressed in miniature breastplates and step into one of these opulent rooms. Soft candlelight pools on a velvet chaise lounge where a porcelain-skinned woman reclines like a living doll. She's dressed in layers of lace so fine they might dissolve if you breathed too hard. This is Donna Isabella, one of Ferdinand's doll mistresses, reportedly chosen for her almost inhuman stillness and childlike face. He brings her here at dusk to amuse himself, dressing her in an array of tiny wigs and gowns, then watching as she sits motionless for hours, an unsettling parody of courtly devotion. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were loving homage to beauty or dark exercises in control. As you move deeper into the suite, you notice trays of small vials arrayed on a glass table, amber-colored liquids, powdered herbs, and odd little glass teeth filled with yellowish oil. These are the king's dubious elixirs, concocted by his favorite physician, Dr. Francisco de Galvan, who once claimed he could restore virility even in a man of 70. Quirky medical lore insists that one mixture contained donkey placenta, steeped in sherry for a week and then filtered through a snail shell. You probably wouldn't drink this if you had a choice, let alone let it near your nether regions, but Ferdinand swallows it down nightly, convinced it will rekindle his lost fire. You skirt around more trays holding vials of mercury and chalk remnants of the era's standard syphilis treatments, and pause at a massive bed encrusted with mother-of-pearl. Legend has it the king once required his mattress maker to stitch silver bells into the seams, so he'd know if any guest dared sneak away in the dark. Some courtier later remarked that nighttime in Ferdinand's chamber sounded like an ill-timed wedding march, a cacophony of clinks and tingles that echoed down the hall. Beyond the bedchamber lies a small chapel, where the king kneels each evening in a robe of crimson silk. Its walls are lined with paintings of the Virgin Mary and saints interceding on behalf of sinners. You step in quietly, listening to his whispered prayers. It's mainstream knowledge that Ferdinand was devoutly Catholic. He leaned on the church to legitimize his tyrannical reversals, and yet here he is, praying fervently for mercy from the same God he seems determined to ignore when it comes to his subjects. "Forgive me," he whispers, eyes squeezed shut, for the things I do out of fear. Fear, you realize, that drives every perverse indulgence lined up in these halls. You wander into a chamber filled with musical instruments, lutes, harpsichords, a single viol with cracked wood. Ferdinand, you've heard, could rarely play, but he insisted on nightly recitals, hiring clumsy musicians who dared not practice in public. One fringe tale claims the king once had a glass cage built so he could sit inside like a human exhibit, listen to these performances, and then throw rotten fruit at anyone who hit a sour note. Whether true or apocryphal, it paints a picture of a man obsessed with spectacle and with reminding everyone that he could indulge any whim, no matter how cruel. A thin corridor of servants' quarters adjoins this wing. You peer in, pale faces. In shadow, silent rows of attendants in gray tunics. Among them, mute guards stand at attention. Yes, the same mutes you heard about, chosen so they couldn't gossip or report overheard secrets. It's a stark contrast to the riot of color and sound you've just left. Here, footsteps are hushed, voices forbidden, and the only permitted noise is the scrape of sandals on flagstone. It's a fringe curiosity turned practical security measure, and it signals just how deep Ferdinand's paranoia runs. Historians still argue whether he truly feared betrayal at every turn or simply wanted to amplify his own sense of superiority. Now you're intoxicated by the palace's atmosphere, part intrigue, part disgust, part awe, and you almost forget the hungry cries of the city outside. But as you exit through a private doorway, you're met with the roar of the midday crowd. The stench of rot, trash, and desperation floods back in, and you're jolted from the courtly dreamscape into a harsh reality. While Ferdinand feasts on girl dolls and questionable tonics, his people starve. You pause on a balcony that overlooks an inner courtyard, where a fountain has run dry and pigeons pick relentlessly at grit and worms. Below, a group of palace workers strains to load crates of wine barrels into a carriage bound for Seville, another of Ferdinand's schemes to sell off regional assets for cash. Someone jokes that the king would auction off the palace itself if he could get away with it. You smirk at the thought, but you keep your head down. You've learned that mockery, even mild, can be dangerous here. As you slip out into the sunlight, the palace gates clang shut behind you. You're left clutching the memory of jasmine oil and metallic bells, the echo of faint prayers, and the unsettling sight of a porcelain-skinned mistress perched motionless on crimson velvet. The contrast between this world and the teeming streets of Madrid feels like crossing between two universes. And here's a light joke before we move on. Imagine going to a spa center today and finding vials of donkey placenta next to the essential oils. You'd check your invoice twice. Yet this king, convinced of his own virility's return, paid handsomely for every bizarre remedy. The palace corridors fade behind you as you head back to the reality of hungry children and ragged beggars. But the images cling. The bells sewn into a bed, the mute guards, the strange doll mistress, and the king's desperate prayers. It's a reminder that power builds its own private fantasies, and sometimes those fantasies are far more terrifying than any revolution brewing outside. You step into the grand antechamber, silk curtains brushing your shoulders like ghostly fingers, as if Spain itself hesitates before the next royal ceremony. The air smells of jasmine and melted candle wax, tinged with a faint metallic note, perhaps the scent of old blood from past funerals. Today, you're here for another wedding. Or rather, another attempt at one, because Ferdinand VII has become notorious for turning marriage into a revolving door of scandal and heartbreak. You probably assumed happily ever after once meant something in a royal court, but in his case, it's closer to happily ever never. Your first brush with these marital oddities comes in 1802, when Ferdinand, barely 16, marries Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. You watch her glide down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk so stiff it creaks like a haunted suit of armor. You note the way Ferdinand avoids her gaze, his dark eyes skittering toward the cheering crowd instead. A mainstream fact sinks in. Maria Antonia dies 4 years later of smallpox, leaving Ferdinand a 17-year-old widower. It's official court record, but whispers suggest she might have contracted the disease at a masked ball where health measures were about as rigorous as palace gossip rules. Historians still argue whether her sudden illness was pure misfortune or the result of deliberate neglect by those who stood to benefit from her death. You almost feel sorry for him, almost until you realize how quickly he moves on. By 1816, he's wedding number 2, Maria Isabel of Portugal. You wander the palace gardens afterward, petals crunching underfoot like brittle confessions. She's barely 17, charming and pale, her laughter clipped with nervousness. The guests marvel at the lavish cake so tall, it practically obscures the stained glass windows, though half the vials afterward taste like baking soda, so maybe that cake was more show than substance. Within 2 years, she dies after childbirth. Or so you're told. No royal baby survives, an odd outcome for such gilded beginnings. The rumor mill churns. Did Ferdinand's court physicians use mercury-laced ointments on her womb? Fringe sources claim one doctor smeared a concoction of crushed mummy fragments in rosewater, believing it could ignite the womb's spark. You're tempted to gag at the imagined aroma. Still, you swallow your reproach curiosity can. Be dangerous here. Next comes marriage number 3, to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony in 1819. You attend the ceremony and feel the gold leaf ceiling press down, opulent to a fault. You taste the undercooked fruit tarts passed around on silver. Trays tangy and half-baked, like most of Ferdinand's matrimonial endeavors. This queen lasts longest, a decade of a union that never produces an heir. She dies in 1829 of complications after yet another miscarriage, leaving Ferdinand once more without a legitimate son. You hear the chapel bells toll 12 times, each chime marking a lost child. Modern readers might balk at equating a child's death toll to something so mechanical, but here it feels as clinical as counting coins. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand's failures in producing an heir were due to his own impotence or the result of medical malpractice by court doctors. The truth is tangled in perfumed linens and whispered accusations. By the time Maria Josepha's wrenching funeral ends, you've grown numb to the opulence around you. You almost miss the ironic grin on Ferdinand's face when he signs the death certificate. Almost. He doesn't mourn publicly. Instead, he retreats to a private chamber lined with mirrors, staring at his own reflection until someone sneaks in to remind him of the next wedding. You imagine him checking his hair in a gilt mirror, whispering, "Next," like advancing through courtly Tinder profiles. Then, in late 1829, wedding number 4, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. You're there again, in a sea of lace and false smiles as she ascends the marble steps. This time, the king seems almost tender. If awkward like a man desperately following instructions in a romance novel he's never read. A mainstream fact, with Maria Cristina, Ferdinand finally fathers 2 daughters, Isabella in 1830 and Luisa Fernanda in 1832, securing the Bourbon line, if only through female heirs. Yet even this success reeks of strategy. Court insiders claim Ferdinand insisted on a fertility room, decorated with fertility symbols, colored eggs, carved mandrake roots, and a crude statue of Priapus rumored to stand bare beside the bed. Quirky and unsettling, you shudder to think of the lighting scheme. Flickering torches casting shadows on a raised plinth. It's like a garden party for Greek phallus gods, with you as an unwanted guest. Despite at last producing heirs, the scandal machine doesn't slow. Rumors swirl that Maria Cristina's pregnancies were overseen by dozens of wet nurses and a rotating cast of doctors who administered nightly bladder teas and slick unguents. Fringe accounts even mention the Spanish bull test, an alleged Ritual where Ferdinand would feed bulls with his own excrements to prove his virility. Thankfully, these stories likely belong in the urban legend category. Yet they spread faster than wildfire among palace servants, each retelling adding another gruesome detail. You catch yourself laughing nervously at one version claiming, "The king once donned a bull's head mask and attempted to charge at courtiers, though." You suspect that's more a jester's joke than genuine history. Through each marriage's rise and fall, the queen's chambers become a carousel of sorrow-empty nurseries, stripped wardrobes, silent baby cradles. You wander halls heavy with outdated hope, where faded tapestries of past queens hang like broken promises. You hear a chambermaid whisper, "He treats marriage like a poor musician treats his violin, play it until it snaps, then toss it away." You gag at the cruelty in her jest, but the truth stings. In Ferdinand's hands, marriage is a tool, not a bond. Let's drop a light joke here. Imagine swiping right on a dating app and finding out your match insists on a mummy fragment face. Mask before every coffee date. You'd block, then ghost for life. Yet for Ferdinand, the quest for an heir becomes this grotesque passion project. One that rewrites courtship into a macabre talent show for doctors and a LCHEMISTS. As you step outside onto a balcony overlooking the Plaza de la Armeria, you see a group of commoners staring up at you. You can't tell if they're saluting the new princess or mocking the procession of widows inside. The wind carries faint strains of a funeral march, though you aren't sure whether it's a brass band practicing or just the echo of tiresome news. Either way, it feels like Spain itself is mourning, or perhaps laughing at its hapless king. You glance at the ivory tower where Ferdinand now retreats, a man whose personal life reads like a tabloid nightmare, except with higher stakes. No one can doubt that he desired an heir, yet every attempt seemed doomed by disease, rumor, or something darker. As twilight settles, you wrap your cloak tighter, the chill in the air, a reminder that royal scandals have a frostbite of their own. Your mind churns with images of wasted gowns, ruined bouquets, and the hollow crown slipping heavier with each loss. And here's your final light joke for this section. If Ferdinand had a dating coach today, they might advise less donkey placenta, more genuine conversation. But of course, genuine conversation is exactly what he's been avoiding, both with his wives and, it seems, with his own heart. You slip through a narrow alley off the main plaza, the scent of roasting chestnuts mingling with horse sweat and unwashed wool coats. Cobblestones slick beneath your boots from last night's rain. Above you, faded posters proclaim, "Viva el Rey," in shaky script propaganda that feels as hollow as the echo of your own footsteps. Here, among the murmurs of discontent, you're about to witness why Ferdinand VII is whispered about as Spain's most hated man. A ragged butcher leans against his shop doorway, cleaver in hand, spitting on the ground as he mutters, "That fool king wouldn't know a real cut of meat if it bit him." You sidle up, nod politely, and ask if he's worried. He snorts and replies, "Worried? No, just hungry." He taxes our pork, but spares no expense on his silver bed bells. You remember those bells, each chime announcing a guest's movement. Each ring a taunt that luxury still thrives inside palace walls while the rest of Madrid starves. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand truly orchestrated these extreme security measures out of paranoia, or because he genuinely enjoyed the sound of his own power. You move on, brushing past a group of soldiers gathered under a flickering lantern. Their uniforms are threadbare, buttons mismatched, and one of them has crudely painted the king's silhouette on his helmet, complete with a tiny crown that wobbles every time he bobs his head. They exchange coded nods, passing around a rolled piece of parchment. You can't quite make out the words, but the gist is clear. Plans for withholding obedience if orders come to arrest more liberals. A mainstream fact here, in 1824, Ferdinand re-established the Spanish Inquisition's courts to root out dissent, granting broad powers to church-affiliated tribunals. Yet somehow, the same church that condemns heretics continues to shield him, blessing his reign in lavish ceremonies and absolving his brutal reprisals. As you skirt the edge of a poorly lit plaza, a nun glides by in crisp white habit, rosary beads clicking against her hip like soft raindrops. She prays silently at a carved stone Madonna before tucking the beads away, offering you a faint, knowing smile. The church's backing of Ferdinand feels schizoid one moment, clergy preach mercy. The next, they chant hosannas while former liberals are dragged to monasteries turned prisons. You wonder if the nuns ever swap gossip about which confessor the king trusts most, or whether they suspect him of slipping communion wafers laced with laudanum into his own hosts to keep himself. Calmed out, you pause at a tavern door, where laughter bubbles out like wine foam. Inside, faces are flushed with cheap sherry and rebellion. You slide onto a stool beside a woman with a kerchief over her head, her eyes bright with cunning. She raises her glass to you. "Here's to the king who can't trust his cooks," she says, her grin wicked. You swallow your sherry in one go and ask why. She leans in, voice low. He suspects everyone of poisoning him. They say he once hired a goat to test his soup. If the goat died, the cook died next. You crack a smile at the image of a bleeding food taster, then shudder at the cruelty. Fringe lore aside, you can't tell if any of it is true, but it underscores Ferdinand's deep-seated fear that everyone conspires against him. Pulling your cloak tighter, you step back into the street. A stray dog scuttles by, tail tucked, eyeing the spilled scraps from a broken produce cart. You're struck by how this city resembles a kingdom of ghost people, haunted by fear, hunger, and a king who trusts no one, despite the plots fermenting. In taverns and soldiers' barracks, Ferdinand's network of informants seems to outpace them all. You think back to the mutes in the palace corridors, those silent sentinels you encountered earlier. Their voices were stripped away so they couldn't reveal secrets, an extreme choice that signals just how badly Ferdinand fears betrayal. Ahead, you see a procession of clergy in black robes, chanting Latin phrases that rumble off the old stone walls. They cross themselves before a statue of the Sacred Heart, and then file into the cathedral, candles flickering like tremors. You slip inside and find yourself in total darkness, except for the altar's flickering glow. Choir boys stumble through a hymn about divine right, their voices wavering like frightened birds. Amid the sanctity, you detect a tension so thick it feels almost tangible. The church here is both a sanctuary for the faithful and a shield for the tyrant. You recall that Ferdinand once declared, "My crown rests on the church's blessing," a mainstream proclamation that sealed his alliance with Rome, even as he denied liberties to his own flock. After the service, the priests disperse, leaving you alone to run your fingers along the cold marble floor. You whisper a silent prayer for Spain, but the silence answers back with a hollow ringing. When you emerge, dusk has settled in purples and grays. Torches ignite along the streets, illuminating graffiti on the walls. "Ferdinand, our king." "Our." Jailer scrawled in hastily mixed charcoal. You trace the letters with your eye, marveling at the courage it takes to scrawl dissent in broad daylight. By now, you're starving, so you duck into a humble eatery. A pot of lentils simmers over a sputtering fire. The cook ladles a portion into a bowl for you. You savor the warmth and ask if she's ever worried the king's spies might be in her kitchen. She shrugs, wiping her hands on her apron. "We all watch our backs," she says. "But what choice do we have? Better to eat his lentils than to starve on the square." You finish your meal and step back into the night. The chill in the air seeps into your bones, a reminder that darkness brings no comfort on these streets. You remember earlier sections, the bells in the bed, the doll mistress, the carousel of dead queens, and see how each feeds into this moment, a kingdom where the ruler's whims collide with his people's simmering rage. Light jokes flutter in your mind like picturing Ferdinand pacing at midnight, retasting his own tears to test their saltiness. But you swallow the laugh, keenly aware that mockery can be as dangerous as an open revolt. As you slip back toward the palace's shadow, you sense eyes on you, informants or rebels. It's impossible to tell. The palace gates loom ahead, iron pikes glinting under torchlight. Behind them, Ferdinand's world awaits, a labyrinth of paranoia, gilded pleasures, and sanctified tyranny. Ahead, the streets of Spain tremble with whispered plots and hollow prayers. You clutch your cloak, heart pounding, knowing that even the church's blessing may not save him when the storm finally breaks. You find yourself in the dimly lit antechamber outside Ferdinand's private suite, the muffled sounds of his labored breathing drifting through a half-closed door. A single lantern swings overhead, casting quivering shadows on the marble floor. Tonight, you stand at the edge of an era, as Spain itself teeters on the brink of change. Outside the palace walls, the distant rumble of carriage wheels carries whispers of revolt. You slip inside, and the air hits you stale incense, sweat, and a faint metallic tang that reminds you of earlier corridors, lined with mercury vials and powdered herbs. The king lies propped on crimson pillows, his once regal robes replaced by a simple gray tunic. His face is pallid, eyes half open, glazed by fever. You remember the bells sewn into his mattress, each ring meant to catch traitors. But here, in this hushed chamber, there's only the soft chime of his last breaths. A mainstream fact: on September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII succumbs to gout and typhus after ruling intermittently for nearly 4 decades. His death marks the end of absolute Bourbon rule and the start of Isabella II's contested reign under the regency of Maria Cristina, a transition that will spark the Carlist Wars, pitting tradition against progress. As you lean closer, you notice a small, faded sketch tucked beneath his pillow, a crude drawing of a porcelain-skinned mistress from long ago, her stillness forever captured in ink. It reminds you of the dull mistress in Section 2, the one who watched him with lifeless devotion while he guzzled donkey placenta tonics and whispered prayers in the hidden chapel. Fringe gossip claims Ferdinand believed that drawing would grant him eternal youth. You tuck it away, unsettled by how far his vanity stretched. A priest kneels at the bedside, muttering absolutions in a rasping whisper. The church's role in his final moments is unmistakable. Decades earlier, he'd declared, "My crown rests on the church's blessing," and now, in these last hours, he clings to that same alliance, eyes drifting to the rosary beads clasped in his hand. You catch the priest pause, glancing at the mute guard standing sentinel in the corner, a living echo of the silent sentinels who once patrolled the palace halls to keep secrets. Even at death's door, Ferdinand's paranoia persists. No one may speak of his final confessions. No whisper may leak beyond these walls. Beyond the bedchamber door, you sense Spain fracturing. In the corridors, courtiers hastily stamp passports for exiles fleeing to France. Soldiers who once plotted mutiny now watch in uneasy silence. You slip out and wander to the palace balcony, where the first pale light of dawn creeps across the city. The bells of the cathedral toll 12 times, not in mourning, but to announce Queen Isabella's accession. You recall the tolling bells of Section 1 marking traitors' executions, and here they toll for a new monarch, a girl of 3, whose name will be a rallying cry for Carlists and liberals alike. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand's final act, altering the succession to favor his daughter over his brother, was a desperate bid for dynastic survival or sheer spite toward traditionalists. Below, the Plaza de Armeria floods with people. Some cheer at the prospect of constitutional monarchy returning. Others mutter curses, brandishing hastily painted placards. Long live Espaga Libre. A few clutch small, battered portraits of Don Carlos, Ferdinand's brother, whom Carlist supporters see as their rightful heir. You drift among them, noting how the same faces that once mocked his silver bell security now curse his memory. A butcher repeats his old taunt, He taxed our pork. We'll tax his memory. While a street child, clutching a tin cup, sobs for coin rather than comfort, you wander into a nearby tavern, the one where soldiers passed coded notes in Section 4. Now the benches are packed with patrons debating the late king's legacy. One veteran whispers, "He was mad as a scholar's debate, no, mad as a fox." Another retorts, "Selfish more than mad, he starved us for his whims." The tavern keeper slides you a small dram of brandy oddly sweet, like the honeyed elixirs Ferdinand once demanded. He raises his glass, "To the king who turned Spain into his plaything. May he rest with the porcelain dolls and donkey placenta vials." You chuckle, a nervous bark that echoes off the stone walls, and clink your glass. You step outside as midday sun burns away the morning mist, and you feel the weight of history pressing down. The couriers ride off with dispatches to the colonies, which by now have almost all declared independence. Spain is diminished, debts mount, and the people bear the scars of wars paid for by Ferdinand's extravagances. You recall the game cage recitals, glass walls, rotten fruit, and see how spectacle masked brutality. His private fantasies, once confined to palace corridors, have left marks on the nation's soul. A stray dog, likely a descendant of the same canine you saw near the dry fountain pads by, sniffing at a discarded royal decree. It tears the parchment in half, scattering words like confessions in the gutter. You smile at the irony. Even in death, Ferdinand's edicts are refused respect. You walk toward the Alhambra's distant towers, picturing the sorrow of exiled nobles and the cautious hope of liberals. Debate still swirls over whether Ferdinand's utter destruction of La Pepa was the fatal misstep that set Spain back a generation, or a necessary correction doomed by his cruelty. Scholars continue to sift through court records, palace diaries, and villagers' tales like the one about his embalmed heart bathed in brandy, displayed in a glass reliquary next to the Virgin's statue. Quirky or macabre, it encapsulates his reign, a bizarre fusion of piety, paranoia, and self-obsession. As dusk gathers once more, you pause on a hill overlooking Granada. The Alhambra glows amber in the fading light, a testament to Spain's storied past. Beneath you, the city hums with life, bearing the weight of Ferdinand's legacy, yet poised to move beyond it. You close your eyes, inhaling the cool evening air scented with orange blossoms and wood smoke, the same fragrances that once filled palace halls. You think of that final lantern swinging in Ferdinand's death chamber, and wonder if any of his fears died with him. You open your eyes to the stars emerging overhead, each one a witness to Spain's unfolding story. The most perverted king in history is gone, but his shadows remain in mute silence, in tolling bells, in dusty court records, and in the debates of survivors. You take one last look at the Alhambra's silhouettes, then turn your back to the palace, ready to step into the next chapter of Spain's journey. Slowly, you feel the world exhale with you. The distant city lights blur like fireflies settling into rest. Each breath you draw is softer, gentler, as if Spain itself were easing into slumber. Recall the pulsing thrill of secret societies, the jingle of silver bells, and the chilling stillness of the dull mistress, the nightmares that once teased your mind. Now they fade into the hush of night. Let the wind's whisper carry a wave of tyrants and the clangor of injustice. In this moment, every heartbeat is a lullaby, every rustle of leaves a tender hush. Rest assured that even in darkness, renewal stirs beneath the surface. Close your eyes, feel the gentle rise and fall of calm breath, and let the memory of Ferdinand's turbulent reign dissolve into dreams of a freer dawn. Sweet silence awaits.